Good evening, everyone. 164 years ago, the courage, heroism, and resistance of the handful of Indians against the colonial oppression rattled the foundations of East India Company. India's first war of independence during 1857 to 1859 comprised series of events which witnessed participation from cross-section of India. It was a resistance from Indian sepoys against the unjust practices in army. It was a challenge from rulers of princely states to defend their kingdoms, a call from peasants and the common men against the oppressive taxation and the economic policies of the British, and against the consistent interference in their everyday way of life. It was a fight against subjugation, injustice, and tyranny. It was a fight for freedom. Though the events remained limited to a few cities and regions in the north of India, the uprising was a watershed in Indian and the British Empire history. British were forced to introduce the Government of India Act 1858, which led to reorganizing in the army, financial system, and administration in India. As India celebrates the 75 years of independence, we today would commemorate the India's first war of independence and would pay our respect to the heroism and courage of the men and women who, despite being outnumbered, challenged the British Raj in India. Now, I request High Commissioner of India, His Excellency Shri Manpreet Vohra, to address the gathering.
Thank you, Ruchika, and good evening, namaskar to all of you. Thank you very much for coming. It's Thursday afternoon, not the finest of weather, but fine in many ways. So for you to take the time out and join us today is a pleasure and an honor for us. As you know, we are celebrating Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, and you see 75 there, and that is because next year, August, will be 75 years of our formal independence. You will also see on the walls of this hall various freedom fighters who gave us our freedom, gave up their life, often in the course of doing that. But what is not perhaps so much visible here is how many more people actually lived and died for India, the cause of India, our freedom, much earlier. Perhaps the early part of the 19th century or the middle of the 19th century, you didn't have photography that was very, very prevalent, and hence one doesn't have too many photographs of those leaders. But it is important to remember that our struggle for freedom and independence actually began much earlier than 1947. And as Ruchika said, it's 154 years now, 64, since the first war of independence, which was in 1857. Some of you, many of you perhaps, who might have studied in India, I certainly remember that our history books, even till the 60s and 70s when I was in school, used to call it the mutiny of 1857. Because that is how it was always described since the actual happenings in 1857 by those who wrote history at that time, and going well into, as I said, the 60s and 70s. But we have changed that and correctly describe it now as our first war of independence, or the uprising of 1857, not the mutiny. Mutiny sounds as if you were rebelling against your own, whereas an uprising or a war of independence is that you're actually doing it for yourself and against the oppressor. So it's important, I suppose, to recall, as we are celebrating 75th years of modern India, to recall the events of the 19th century as well. Indeed, while 1857 is the best known war of independence, and it was certainly at a large enough scale, I don't think too many people are aware that, frankly, we actually had a small uprising even 50 or 51 years before that. I think it was 1806 when there was an uprising small one, as I said, but in Vellore, in Tamil Nadu. Of course, that didn't get anywhere, and the 1857 uprising was also put down by the British government. Well, it was the East India Company then. But it's important to recall that perhaps outside of the Spanish Empire in Latin America, Central America and South America, and perhaps the events in North America, what is today USA and Canada, perhaps this was the only example of any major battle for independence, uprising of the kind we had against a colonial empire anywhere on the planet. It was here in India in 1857 that we had the first uprising. So in many ways, while many of the countries that we are all aware of, including the country we are living in right now, attained their independence much earlier, and in a different mode, we actually fought for it much earlier. And therefore, the battle against colonialism, against oppression, against exploitation, against racial discrimination, prejudice against the natives, which were the Indians, as they were called then. All that is something that we rose up against much, much earlier than those things are otherwise known about, apartheid or civil rights movements, etc., etc. We tried to root that out much, much earlier than it happened in other parts of the world. Some places it didn't happen. In many major places, it didn't happen till well into the 20th century, or even much later in the 20th century, just a couple of decades or 3 decades ago. So it's, as I said, important to recall all this. It's important to take pride in our history, some of the lesser known aspects perhaps of our history, why things happened the way they happened, who fought for our freedom at that time. Many of us know the better known names of Rani Ki Jhansi and Nana Sahab and Tantia Tope, but there were so many other personalities as well. That I'm sure in a few minutes when Professor Jha speaks to us and gives us his lecture on the uprising of 1857, we will learn much more about today. I'm sure with his research and academic credentials, he will enthrall us with facts and insights into the happenings of 1857, and we will all be much enriched this evening after we have heard Professor Jha. Thank you very much. Ruchika, do you want to invite him, or should I invite him? No, I don't want to go against your run sheet.
No, sir.
No, you need to introduce it.
Sir.
Yeah. So thank you very much for joining us, as I said, and enjoy the evening. Professor Jha, I hope the samosa is wafting in your nostrils as well. And so there is something else to look forward to also. So, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, sir. As you rightly mentioned, there are many stories which we have heard, which we have not heard, many heroes sung and unsung. But this is a small ode to the people we know. Now I would request Professor Raghbendra Jha to deliver his talk. Professor Raghbendra Jha is Emeritus Professor of Economics in the Ardent Cotton Department of Economics at Crawford School of Public Policy. He is Fellow of the World Innovation Foundation and specializes in development economics, macroeconomics, and public economics. Professor Jha.
Thank you. Thank you very much, High Commissioner, and thank you very much, Ruchika, for that very warm introduction. I'm very honored and delighted to use this occasion to pay my homage to very brave and daring Indians many, many years ago, more than a century ago, who worked tirelessly for the freedom of their country. The 1857 Indian War of Independence is something terribly important. You should understand that it probably is, or probably was, the greatest movement for freedom from colonial rule in the 19th century. In the 19th century, there was no other freedom movement or a burst for fighting against colonialism compared to the 1857 uprising. In the 18th century, there was one other major freedom struggle to throw away colonial powers, that was the American War of Independence. And they succeeded, and they are very well known and very fancied, and so much has been written on them in various ways, and it's part of the folklore of the United States and many other countries. But unfortunately, not much is written about 1857, at least not to the same extent. The only reason perhaps was that the 1857 uprising failed, although some of the reasons for the failure of the 1857 uprising were common to the 1776 uprising in the United States. One of the main reasons why the 1857 uprising did not succeed was the lack of a central leadership for the movement. It was a big problem. But the same was true of the American War of Independence. You might remember George Washington's famous statement, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly we will all hang separately," because they were pressures to break up that movement against British colonialism in America as well. So what I'm going to talk about today is, I'm not a historian, as my introduction has revealed. But what I have done for the past several years, and finally got published in 2018, I published a pretty large 2-volume book called Facets of India's Economy and Society. So which I have traced India since 0 AD, and so part of that volume, this is the treatment of India's freedom struggle and India's condition under the rule of the East India Company and the Crown. So I will talk a little bit from chapters 5 and 6 of the first volume of this 2-volume work. The first thing I would like to say here is that I agree completely with the High Commissioner. Why call it mutiny? Okay, this was an uprising against a private limited company by groups which were at least within their own territory sovereign powers. So why call it a mutiny? And a mutiny against whom? Not against a private limited company. They didn't have any sovereign rights until then. They were just trading groups. Later on, it became, they called it a sepoy mutiny. So not even Sipahi mutiny. And this is probably because the British were unable to pronounce Sipahi, so they called it Sepoy. Unfortunately, many Indians also followed in their footsteps and called it Sepoy mutiny. So I'll talk a little bit, sort of try to talk in a structured way about the Indian War of Independence, first War of Independence, and I'll try to be as objective and scientific as possible. But since I'm speaking about my own country, I think I'm allowed to be a little emotional at times. There were three, in my view, there were three reasons for the 1857 uprising. In fact, as the High Commissioner was mentioning, There were uprisings prior to 1857, and there is the Indigo, he talked about the uprising in Vellore. There was uprising by Indigo workers in Bengal prior to that. There was this uprising led by the great Birsa Munda in the Jharkhand area. So, but nothing structured or capable of replacing the East India Company had come through until 1857. So I think the characterization of 1857 uprising as India's first war of independence by Veer Savarkar holds a lot of merit. So he wrote a book on the first war of independence after studying it in England, and he was the first one to use this nomenclature. So now let's look at the reasons for the uprisings, and then I will talk. There are three elements to this reason. One is the state of the peasants of India. The second was the state of the local rulers, and the third one is the status of soldiers in the East India Company army. So peasants in India have been impoverished for very long, including in the Mughal rule. So during Mughal rule until the time of Akbar, 1/13 of the produce of Indian farmers used to go as a tax towards the sovereign or the local ruler or whatever, and that was increased to 1/3 during the time of Akbar. Okay, this is not me saying it. This is stated by Henry Carey, who's a very important author in this area. Henry Carey was the chief economic advisor of then President Abraham Lincoln of the United States. So he has carefully catalogued the movement in tax revenue, during Mughal rule, and it jumped from 1/13 to 1/3 during Akbar's time because he needed to expand his empire. The Mughal Empire was being expanded, but that of course levied a huge burden on the farmers. So there was no investment in agriculture, and then during the rule of the East India Company, there was a big pressure to change the pattern of Indian agriculture from that based on food to that based on commercial crops, because they needed cotton and various other things from India to feed the industrial revolution that was occurring in England. So that was central, the switch in cropping pattern from food and wheat and rice and whatever to cotton and jute and various other things. So this led to a real collapse of the high taxes, and the switch in the cropping pattern led to a real collapse of the agrarian sector in India. And Henry Carey, whom I have just talked about, the chief economic advisor of President Lincoln, wrote in his book, it's a very interesting book, that the famines that occurred during the rule of the East India Company were not just random occurrences. They were actually part of a policy. Why was the policy needed? The policy was needed because the East India Company needed a lot of workers to work in things like the construction of railways and various infrastructure projects. So the population of India was not what it is now, very, very low. So to induce people to move from villages to towns and cities and railway construction sites, the deprivation of the agrarian sector was a central tool to accomplish that. This is according to Henry Carey. So as a result of that, there were repeated famines in India, and you would be shocked to learn how many people died in India because of famines during British rule. You'll be absolutely shocked. And remember that death from famine is separate from and over and above death from natural causes. So it's not that all deaths are being counted. All deaths during a famine period are being counted as deaths due to famines. Some of them are deaths due to natural causes. So as many as, I don't know, some of you may know this figure, but as many as 52 million Indians died from famines during the rule of the East India Company and the Crown. So one of the most famous cases of famines is, of course, the 1943 famine, and that is a real issue, because at that time because the Second World War was going on, and ships laden with food grown in India were being diverted to European troops rather than being used for feeding the Indian population. So the peasants were in great stress during the time of the East India Company, and later during the time of the British rule. Now, if you look at the second component of the reasons that I have been talking about, is the problems being faced by local rulers and kings and nawabs and so on. So there were several elements to this, and I will talk about some of them. One is the doctrine of lapse, which was being used. The East India Company, after their first victory in 1757, major victory, 1757 in the Battle of Plassey, they started expanding their empire, and one of the tools that they used was that if a nawab or a ruler did not have a male heir, then they would basically lose their territory, and it would fall to East India country control. And for example, Rani Lakshmi Bai had an adopted son whom she wanted to become the heir to the throne of Jhansi, and that this was not allowed. And this was similar problem occurred with another famous female warrior of the First War of Independence, Rani Avanti Bai in Madhya Pradesh, and similar stories apply to Nana Sahib, Tata Kote, and several others. In 1849, Dalhousie made the proclamation that Bahadur Shah Zafar would be the last Mughal ruler of India. He just said so, and that really that really disturbed the local kings and nawabs, because they had been used to a certain coexistence. Although they were formally independent, they had a certain coexistence relationship with the Mughal throne in Delhi. But they were very upset by the announcement by Dalhousie that Bahadur Shah Zafar would be the last ruler of Mughal ruler of India. Now we come to the third component, these Indian soldiers. Indian soldiers were very badly treated in terms of pay and benefits by the East India Company. Though there was differential treatment, the British troops used to get much higher pay and benefits apart from various other royalties and gifts, which of course were denied to the Indian soldiers. And many of these troops came from farming families. Okay, so this was so they shared some of the problems that the agrarian sector was facing. So there was a feedback effect from the problems faced by the agrarian sector and the troops and the agrarian sector. The second one was another important component was that there was a law enacted to force Indian troops to cross the sea to fight foreign wars. particularly in Burma. You might know that the Anglo-Burmese wars, again something which we don't talk about very much. The Anglo-Burmese war was one of the most vicious and severe wars fought by the British in the Indian subcontinent. And Indian troops had to cross the Bengal to go to Burma and fight those wars. And there was a feeling in those days that crossing the sea was bad. So Indian troops resented that. Although they were happy, they were quite okay with taking the land route to Burma, but using the sea route was something which they did not like. There were other certain other religious practices in India which the British had clamped on, and that also bothered Indian troops very much. This same law, which was used to transport Indian troops to fight in Burma, was used to send Indian troops to fight in the First and Second World Wars. And of course, as you know, what a great price India has paid in terms of troops lost and various other things. Just imagine what it would have been like in 1918, when there was the previous pandemic was there, and the Indian troops were fighting in Europe, and of course there was no healthcare worth speaking of in India, and they were fighting the First World War, somebody else's war, under such severe conditions. So many thousands and thousands of troops just died, and many of them who did not die were the unlucky ones, because they had terrible problems after that. Another important reason for the dissatisfaction of the Indian troops was the allegation that the ammunition or the bullets that were being used by the East India Company commanders were laced with pork and beef lard. So this was objectionable. This was objected to by both the Hindu and Muslim troops, and they didn't like it at all. Furthermore, in the 1830s, large-scale conversion had started in India, and the British had passed a law saying that if somebody converted from Hinduism to Christianity or something, then they would not lose the right to inherit the property of their ancestors. So these were some of the factors that were really upsetting the Indian troops. So the combination of these three factors, in my view, led to the uprising. So the immediate provocation and blowing out of uprising, if you look at this section, so on 29th March 1857, India's first martyr, first freedom fighter, if you would like to call him that, Mangal Pandey, was hanged in Meerut for rising against British rule. Soldiers of who were with his group also rebelled. Then between 2nd May 1857 and 10 May 1857, what these soldiers did was they freed their comrades who were being held by the British in prisons, and they declared war on the British, captured weapons, and burnt the properties of the East India Company. This is all happening in Meerut, slightly to the east of Delhi. So then the fact that the soldiers were rising, had taken up arms and were holding and had defeated the British, led to a popular rise in sentiment throughout the country, especially among the farming community. So from being confined to troops under the East India Company, it spread to farmers. And then from the farmers, it spread to all the nawabs and the principal rulers who were also very who were also not very had not taken kindly to the policies of the East India Company. So it became from a revolt of some troops, it became a people's revolt. On 10th May 1857, under the cover of darkness, troops from Meerut entered Delhi. And when they entered Delhi, they tried to persuade Bahadur Shah Zafar to lead the movement so that they could establish a Indian central rule under the Mughals once again. Bahadur Shah Zafar was a very old and feeble person at that time. He initially refused, but then under pressure he relented and agreed to lead the movement. And he wrote to all the major kings and nawabs all over the country and asked them to join this movement against the British. So there were many regional leaders who became very famous during this time. Of course, there is Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi, Nana Sahib in Kanpur, and British actually. Nana Sahib was so aggressive and so successful that British had to abandon Kanpur as well. Begum Hazrat Mahal in Lucknow, Rani Avanti Bai in Madhya Pradesh, Babu Kumar Singh in Bihar, and so on. There were many other very important freedom fighters. And so for a while and for several months, Delhi was not occupied by the British, it was occupied by the rebelling troops. So the British reacted to all this by calling fresh troops from England, and then they started to change a number of policies. So what were the policy changes? So they basically said that they abrogated the doctrine of lapse rule. So if somebody did not have a male heir, didn't mean that the territory would automatically go to the British. Then when they captured Delhi, they ensured that there was no male lineage from the Mughal side. They shot dead the sons of Bahadur Shah Zafar and sent Bahadur Shah Zafar to Rangoon, where he perished. And then they started giving inducements to Nawabs, so telling them that they could be under the protectorate of the British, provided they accepted the British Crown as their head. Then what else happened was that in 1858, immediately after the peak of the uprising, the British Crown took over the rule of India. Queen Victoria became Empress of India, and she in fact had a very regal. It can be very lavish. You can read some descriptions about how lavish the function was in Delhi to install Queen Victoria as India's Empress, and this was against the background of two raging famines in the country. So the insensitivity that was going on is there for everybody to see. So another thing that they did was they reduced, since they had faced a lot of problems from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, they reduced they changed the constitution of the Indian military from primarily being Bihar and UP based to increasing the representation of Gurkhas, Sikhs, and Afghan soldiers. So that there was a change in the composition of the Indian troops. Okay, then the effects went on. So all the Nawabs, at the time of independence, they were 562 or something like that. These people just accepted the queen as their head and paid huge sums of money to the British Empire, but were nominally the rulers of their own little fiefdoms. And then there was a big change in attitude on the part of the British rulers. There's a very interesting book by Pankaj Mishra, some of you may have read it. It's called On the Ruins of Colonialism. It describes the factors that led to the collapse of the British Empire in various parts of the world. And Pankaj Mishra says in this book that when the British soldiers who were working in India during the Indian War of Independence, when they were transferred to other areas who were populated by people who had skin like ours, for example, if they were transferred to Egypt, they were extremely nasty. So they thought that anybody who had this color was going to attack them and kill them and so on and so forth. So Pankaj Mishra describes in detail how these factors worked in countries like Egypt and other countries of Africa. So now let me finally come to, do you have more time or just, let's take 5 minutes more? Yeah. So I'll talk a little bit about the reasons for the failure of the uprising. The first one is the absence of central authority. Okay, Bahadur Shah Zafar was a very weak ruler. If you have seen the Sound and Light show in Delhi, at least in the Red Fort, in the old days, they used to say that there was a dispute between two washermen on the Yamuna coast, and they had come to Bahadur Shah Zafar to adjudicate the matter, and he said, my kingdom doesn't extend to the Yamuna, which used to flow just behind the Red Fort. So this was the state of affairs. The Indian rulers were very, very weak central authority. Just look at this fact. From 1526, when Babur established his foothold in India, to 1707, which was the death of Aurangzeb, there were only 6 Mughal rulers in India, such high, and all from the same family. So such high centralized rule was there. But between 1707 and 1857, so 181 years, 6 rulers, and 1707 to 1857, 150 years. Guess how many Mughal rulers were there? 1857, when Bahadur Shah Zafar was killed, was dethroned. There were 21 Mughal rulers. So this was the state of disarray of central authority in India. It was a revolving door. The throne of India was a revolving door. Really, people would come and go, and 21 rulers in 150 years. The second the second factor was the absence of financial resources. They did not have the financial resources to sustain such a large revolutionary effort. And then there was the very successful effort by British to win loyalty of many rulers through various means, through giving them inducements, giving them money, giving them power, titles, which they greedily lapped up, and so on. So after the War of Independence in 1858, as I had said, there was the coronation of the Queen, and much later on, the British decided that they would need to give Indians some representation in the running of India. So in 1885, a Scotsman called Alan Octavian Home founded the Indian National Congress. But initially, for a very long time, actually, there was hardly any. There was no, not hardly. There was no Indian representation in the Indian National Congress. It happened only much later on, and it was basically an organization meant to assist the British in relating to the people of the country. So this is the story of the 1857 revolution. I want to just end by reading out a quote, two quotes. Two quotes. One is by the great Ahilyabai Holkar. This is before the war. Ahilyabai Holkar, of course, is one of India's greatest women ever, and many people in India call her Ma because she really deserves that title. In 1772, Holkar wrote to the Peshwa to say, "Other beasts like tigers can be killed by might or contrivance, but to kill a bear, it is very difficult. It will die only if you kill it straight in the face." This is Ahilyabai Holkar writing to the Peshwa. More than 150 years later, Subhash Chandra Bose said almost the same thing. He writes in his book, "The greatest folly and mistake of our predecessors was their inability to realize at the very beginning the real character and role of the Britishers who came to India. It was much later that they realized that the British had come to conquer and plunder and not to settle down in India." I'll end with that. Thank you very much.
I request the audience, if they have any question or they want to share some thought with Professor Jha and discuss some of their thoughts that they have in mind. Anyone?
I just want to ask Professor Jha.
Yes.
There is one theory, or there is another thought is there, that because of this 1857 first independence war, it has having some reverse effect. Like before that, the things were much more cool, and the Britishers were not that aggressive and oppressive. But after 1857, because this Victoria has been like it has come under British rule, they have become a centralized power, and they become more oppressive, and there is like oppression and exploitation has become more after 1857.
Yeah, if you think that dying by famine is okay, then I agree with you. There were so many famines during that period. People died slow deaths. They were not killed by the sword, but they as I said earlier, there was a huge number of famines and complete destruction of the economy, which led to the crisis which followed 1857. It's a continuum. It's not as if there is a break. It's a continuum that is occurring. So I think that what 1857 did was that it instilled in the people a sense of both a sense of self-confidence, that they could actually attack. In fact, please remember, this is very important. This has been said in a number of articles and books after Henry Carey and so on and so forth, that during the 1857 uprising, the 1857 uprising was the only serious case of uprising, apart from the Azad Hind Force, which was much later on, where Indians actually fought with the British, physically fought with it. There was sporadic instances of violence by various freedom fighters. That's a different thing. But an organized military troops fighting British in India, I think 1857 is the most significant example and probably the only example, because many people have said that after the 1857 struggle, when Indians were shot at by troops, there were not many Britishers who were using the guns. So Indians were using the guns against their own people in 1942 or wherever else you look at it.
Would you agree, Professor Jha, that there is a positive side to the First War of Independence, a major positive side, while it may have failed and a lot of people died, and while the British Crown took over, the death of the East India Company and the taking over by the Crown, and some of the even larger oppression and atrocities that you refer to, all that happened. But in a sense, the rise of modern India and political awareness and political empowerment, the thought, and you just alluded to the word, you used the word confidence just now. All that started then, because while the British Empire came in, etc., there were certain tides that could not be turned, partly because of what was happening in India, partly, of course, because of what was also happening in England and Western thought and so the rise of civil society, the beginning of political parties, the participation of Indians in political parties, the establishment of higher education institute, the rise of people like Sir Syed Ahmed and on the economic side, Dadabhai, Nauroji, Motilal Nehru, all of that then, slowly and steadily led to the British having to cede more and more to the Indians, the natives, entry into the civil service, entry into some higher or middle echelons of the army, and finally, of course, culminating in independence. So there is, I think, I wouldn't call it futile.
No. Please don't get me wrong.
No, you didn't either. I'm saying nobody should think that.
No, I think it was very essential. It was part of the process of maturing of modern India, because it was this that gave Indians the confidence that they realized that they had to fight, and they realized that they had to come together. So this is exactly what happened during the First World War and the Second World War. The fact that the bravery of Indian troops on the battlefields of Europe and Africa during the two world wars is legendary. In fact, French officials have admitted that had Indian troops not been there, they would have lost a huge amount of territory. So the point is that they learned how to fight. They learned how to coalesce into an army. They learned how to fight, and they learned how to be organized. So these are absolutely precious, priceless gifts which the 1857 uprising gave to India. Definitely, I completely agree with you. On that.
I have a question. So if we kind of focus only on 1857 and not think about what happened in the 1900s, 1857 and prior to that, so we could probably say that the rulers of the time abrogated on their responsibility to look after the people. And so part of the responsibility for the famine and the sad state of the peasants would be the responsibility of the rulers who did not do their job well. And East India Company, of course, was a private company. It was not the crown. So East India Company took the advantage. It's business. It will exploit wherever it will go, and that's what it had done. So to say that that it was the British groups on the other side, or to say that the responsibility of everything lies on the East India Company, would that be correct?
Well, let me say this very clearly. I'll have to the structure of land taxes, which is central to which is the division of. If you look at the incident, first of all, let me rephrase that. If you look at the incidents of famines across the country, they're primarily in British India, not in the areas ruled by these Nawabs. And I mean, for example, if you look at Mysore, if you look at the state of Mysore, Mysore was in 1901. There's a beautiful article in the Atlantic magazine, famous Atlantic magazine, which asked the question, what are the British doing here? In 1901, this was an article in the Atlantic saying that the Mysore state was so prosperous and people were so well cared for that they would be the envy of every state in the country, including British India. That's one thing. The second thing is that the structure of tariffs, the tax structure, which the proportion of the crops that you take away as tax from the farmers was much lower in the protectorates and the small kingdoms as compared to British India. So because they had to do a lot, and I haven't given estimates of the amount of drain that occurred, that economic drain that occurred during this period. You can get a sense of that from my book, or there's a famous book by R.C. Mazumdar, 1902. He wrote a very nice book on India's economic history, and he has given very solid evidence of the amount of drain that occurred in British India. A remarkable man, because in 1902, sitting in India, he could have the courage to write a book like that. So anyway, yeah.
I just following on from what, this is more a comment than a question, and following on from what Sunita just said, and that's exactly, I've been thinking, I'm a student of history as well, and I have grown up reading history as a Sepoy mutiny, etc. And while you were talking, one of the things I really learned today is about, I know Churchill and famine very well, and my view of Churchill is formed many times with the Bengal famine, but I had never realized that the economic, the work that was happening economically in India with railways, that actually had an impact on famines in India. So that was really good, and it was very good to know that fact. But yes, I have, the failure of 1857, like I said, I grew up studying history in a very traditional way that we were taught. And one of the things I was thinking is the success that the independence movement had was because it was a mass movement. It came from below. But this one, when I was hearing you just now, again, because I have worked so much on vaccine at the moment, I have forgotten all the history. But one of the things that was coming into my mind, that they started, the rebellion started, of course there was absence of a central agency, but also it was more about, it affected the rulers. The fight was because, you talked about Rani Lakshmibai, you talked about Nana Sahib, you talked about doctrine of lapse. But it was not so much I think everything that the people were suffering, that hadn't come to the forefront. So maybe that could have been one of because it was the rulers who were affected and they rebelled. It was the sepoys who were affected and they rebelled, but it was not the actual masses, which we see later on when the International Congress came and Gandhi came and how it came. So that was one thing that was coming, so I thought I'll just say that. But yes, that is, and one of the things that I've always, as a student of history, of Indian history, I've always questioned everything as to how did we even come to this stage where we started getting ruled, because I still remember the photograph in Jahangir's court in Chennai when the East India Company person wanted to present its credentials to Jahangir then, and there's a photograph that I have seen during my studies, and we came to this. Why was it? Because of was it selfishness? What is it of the rulers at the time that we became what we became? Is what I often think. It's just I'm thinking aloud. There's not a question. It's just an observation.
Yeah. No. But, thank you. In response to the first question. I must say that and this is again going back to an issue that the High Commissioner raised, also that the impetus behind the uprising came from all the three sources that I mentioned. It came from the peasants, it came from the troops, it came from the nobles and military. All three of them contributed. And in fact, I didn't mention it so much here. I don't have very accurate figures on that. But one of the tactics that was used by Gandhi and Patel and so on and so forth after the, in the latter part of the freedom struggle had their origins in the 1857 struggle, where the peasants stopped giving lagan to the British collectors. So this was their contribution to the so it's not so that has a continuity since then. Yes, the activities of the troops are most evident because people were killed and cities were overrun and so on. And then after that, the famous when the British re-entered Delhi, there was this famous couplet from Ghalib who says that from every branch of every tree in the walled city of Delhi there was a corpse hanging. They were so brutal in repressing the uprising. But the point is that many of the tactics that were used were followed from the 1857 thing. I mean, I have never been a history student. Okay, so all this I have learned on my own. So, but what I will say is that I think that the big thing missing in the freedom struggle after 1857, which was present in 1857, was the element of the army, because India had moved to a non-violent movement. So armed rebellion had been ruled out, but rebellion by the peasantry and so on, they were definitely very much in continuity from the old days.
I'm very sorry, we may have to end because of the limited time available in hand. So please.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jha, for so aptly bringing out the different and variety of reasons that led to the uprising. And as High Commissioner, and you have correctly mentioned that this was one of the most significant movements that took place against the British Empire as such. Now to end, I would just quote a couplet that I have been hearing, most of you must have been hearing from your childhood, and which instills that spirit and passion in us. बूढ़े भारत में आई फिर से नई जवानी थी, गुमी हुई आज़ादी की कीमत सबने पहचानी थी, दूर फिरंगी को करने की सबने मन में ठानी थी, चमक उठी सन 57 में वह तलवार पुरानी थी, दिखा गई पथ सिखा गई हमको जो सीख सिखानी थी, खूब लड़ी मर्दानी वो तो झांसी वाली रानी थी. Thank you everyone for joining us. I invite you all to kindly join us for tea.